Museum and state financing in general. I did want to remind you that we have the IVAS meeting the first Wednesday of the month. The October meeting is going to be October the 7th, and that'll be in Lewiston at the Visitor Center. Visitor Center is easy to find. It's on the main street. It's just north of the Subway restaurant. We'll be there at 7 o'clock. As far as notifying everybody of the meeting times and details and that kind of thing, you will be receiving emails if you have a computer, and if not, we'll be well publicized in local papers as far as the time and the subject matter, etc. I would remind you that on the 7th of October, our meeting, we're going to have Farrell Anderson from the Quad City areas. He's been very active in archaeology and also served as president of the IAAA, which we're a member of. And he's going to be talking on decoding the past, searching for the Sockinaw and Black Hawk's home site. Black Hawk lived in the Quad City areas, and they recently located the village and even his homestead. So this will be a good protohistoric talk. You'll all really enjoy it. He's an excellent speaker with a lot of experience. My pleasure to introduce the well-known speaker this evening, always enlightening, always interesting, Dr. Mike Wiant.
I am overwhelmed. And I wanted to do something special tonight. I wanted you to have the pleasure of listening to a museum director who was appropriately attired. And so earlier this evening I came down and decided that if I'm standing behind this podium and I undo the top of these overalls and flop them down, it looks like I'm wearing a shirt. However, I noticed that every time I said the word "the," my trousers fell down to my knees. It just wouldn't do. So you gotta have this. A question already.
If you are in fact going to retire, are is those coveralls going in some sort of a museum?
These have got a lot of wear left in them. It was a distinct privilege to be asked to be the director of this institution. As a young archaeology student, a young man, this place holds a unique and special place in the annals of archaeology. Becoming a director is, I will tell you, not an easy decision. One of the first things that I did was to ask colleagues of mine who had decided to move from the academy or from doing research archaeology or contract archaeological work, and say to them, what about this transition? You take on administrative responsibilities, and in a great many ways you walk away from the everyday work of archaeology. And for those of us who grew up thinking only of that, it's not an easy transition. And I will tell you, there are some days when you wonder mightily why you made the decision to do so. Today is not one of those days. Today is a day of immense privilege. And it's immense privilege to be able to stand at this podium in this auditorium, noted as the Fay Cooper Cole Auditorium when the museum was dedicated in 1972. A man who has a legacy in this place and in North American archaeology. To be able to stand here and talk about what this institution has accomplished over time. And I will tell you, and it's a fair question, I already posed it to the senior archaeologist of this staff, and I said, the first thing people are going to say is, why aren't you giving this talk? And I told him I'd already anticipated an answer, and I was going to exercise it, and that was, you shouldn't be able to talk about yourself. And so I come to this podium to talk about Alan Harn's work, And I'm delighted to tell you that as I cast my eyes across the audience, I have the privilege to talk about the work of a great many others. In particular, I would like to tell you that this is not only a conversation about the professional archaeologists who have held forth at this institution for a great many years, but it is also a celebration of you. Every one of you, in one way, shape, or form, I know from looking around this auditorium, have been part of this institution in some way, shape, or form, whether it's an educational program, whether it's walking the banks of the Illinois River and picking up artifacts, whether it's working in the laboratory. The Illinois Valley Archaeological Society and all of its friends are to be credited as well about the story that I'm about ready to relate to you, because it is a story of passion and interest in a subject matter, and it will demonstrate to you what a group of people can do who are curious and have the capacity and interest and energy to carry through on that. And I want to foreshadow the ending, a bad thing for a speaker to do, because once you utter this, people will get itchy and want to walk out the door. But I will tell you that we're not done. And our future is wobbly, but I have some assurances that we may have a hiatus, but I have some confidence that we will be back to work here. And we will build on the legacy that I relate to you this evening. And I will encourage you to come back time and time again to look at new exhibits, to listen to new presentations, to explore the past as we do, to get some sense about what the world is and how it's worked in the past and what it means to us. So without further ado, I'll proceed. If things come to mind, it's always easier for me to make this storytelling, and you have the freedom to raise your hand at any point and say, what's that mean? What about that? And so on. I will especially expect my colleagues to nudge me in the right direction periodically, because I'm walking out onto a landscape which I've consumed really as a visitor, and have had very little of my own hands in this work. So Mike, Alan, Dwayne, Sharon, all of you nurse me along in this business. Now, I want to start with this because the title says something about archaeology and anthropology. And I will tell you, though this phrase was written a great long while ago, and it turns out, in fact, a little before 1958, the quotation was first uttered that American archaeology is archaeology, is anthropology, or it is nothing. But it was later revised to say this, and I think it's an important way to begin, because for many of you who know easily in your mind about archaeology and what's involved in it, our ultimate goal is to learn about humanity and how human beings have essentially created the course and the path of history that they've created. So history becomes a terribly important part of this enterprise. But I would tell you, we're also very curious about how human society works and how it is that under certain circumstances invention may proliferate, or that people begin to maneuver on a particular landscape, or that there are socio-political dimensions that begin to grow, or marriage patterns happen to grow out of certain situations, or even down to the duration of time that a mother will nurse a child, also has connections to the anthropology of the world. People do things for certain reasons. Hunter-gatherers tend to nurse their children for a very long time. Agriculturalists tend not to. And so this anthropological dimension of it becomes important to us, and certainly in North America, but also now around the world, we explore the past to try to draw some understanding about humanity in general. History and then anthropology, we work these things together. So I give you that as the principal foundation to this. Now, I would tell you, for many of you in the audience, you were privy to a lecture generated by Alan some years ago called Igniting the Torch. And the main thrust of this was to look at the role of Dickson Mounds, the excavation at Dickson Mounds, and how it created this, to use an anthropological term, how this notion about the presentation of human remains and their study and presentation to the public as an educational enterprise was diffused in America at the Wycliffe Mound, at the Salina Burial Pit, at the Meyer Mound across from Peoria. And he used this term, sort of igniting the torch, to talk about the spark that this particular place created that resulted in a whole variety of other kinds of activities. So in a sense, if you will, and I don't want to overuse the phrase, a colleague of mine has talked about the fluorescence of Cahokia as a big bang. There was a bang here too. And it was discharged, and the bang here was not simply an academic enterprise, it became a public enterprise. And people were drawn to this place to explore the past, perhaps for the first time in their life, of stepping out of history and really stepping into prehistory, to recognize that reading artifacts would give them a sense of the human condition over a very long period of time, would give meaning to the fact that they walked through cornfields and picked up objects and looked at them and realized that not only were there people here before us, but they had a very different way of life, and that life wasn't constant, it changed. There was a real dynamism to the land and the people who lived here. So in a great many ways, this became a portal to the past, and the Dicksons introduced people to the distant past, a way of looking at the world around them that is not so easy to see in a variety of different places. Stuart Strieber once told me that the greatest thing about the Illinois River Valley was it was essentially the greatest uncharted archaeological laboratory in the middle of this country. In other words, that the record is rich and relatively undisturbed, and it is a place that has drawn the attention of avocational archaeologists and professionals for a very long time. So what we'll do in this presentation is to, if you will, to relight this torch and to look at the broad sweep of archaeological endeavor in this particular place. You'll see that I have sort of stops along the way, and what I want to do, the first word in lowercase is essentially the place I want to talk about, and these will be brief vignettes. Needless to say, we could serve several meals here and pass out sleeping bags to give it due justice. I promise you that, well, I might get carried away, but the large caps are sort of my thinking about some of the broader theoretical ramifications of this. So when you say Dickson Mounds, the kinds of things that come to mind are bioanthropology, the study of the human organism, understanding how we can read human skeletons and their physical health-related characteristics, etc. The other would be social dimensions of mortuary practices. In other words, what do human remains tell us about human society? And then third, the notion of cultural transformation. One of the great things about this excavation, which Don Dickson probably didn't appreciate, but which has clearly come to rise to the fore and will be articulated by Alan in a major monograph, will be that these remains tell us about how human society changes and what influences it and so on. This iconic image of a man with immense curiosity who begins an excavation here, but creates an excavation at this place which you all well know was enormously different than the excavations which had been conducted in a great many other places. Rather than an undertaking which was to collect objects, in a sense, Dickson's efforts are to reveal objects, to expose them to the eye and the senses and the consideration, and then to use it as a backdrop for contemplation, to try to interpret to the public about what this meant. So it wasn't, in a sense, a sterile pot on exhibit at a museum, that we have some ideas about how old it is and its method of manufacture and so on. It was literally looking at humanity and using humanity to begin to articulate a story. Now, in 1927, the world is a very, very different place than it is today. The interest in the past is being expressed in a variety of different ways worldwide, and it is very clear from the attendance records that have been accumulated at this place that hundreds, thousands, in fact millions of people have come here to learn from that exposure and get some sense about it. What we know is at least initially summarized in part by Alan's monograph. And one thing that I'm going to return to time and time again is the fact that this institution has a notable publication record, And in addition, we will see in a moment that it has essentially part of that Big Bang diffusion is that there's been an incredible amount of publication by others who've come here to learn about the subject and use the information that's here. So it has generated a remarkable amount of academic work. And so in addition to people becoming to come here and be enriched by the presentation and be contemplative about it, the other thing that was going on all along was from a relatively early time in the state's acquisition of this as an undertaking to explore it academically, to learn about what this meant, to not only articulate it to the public, but to put it in words and to relate it to a broader mass of anthropological thinking, to learn about these issues. This monograph, which is unlikely anybody picks up and reads just because it is a series of abstracts, is a compilation undertaken by two of our colleagues that is a catalog, a listing of all of the professional publications that were generated by inspecting the remains of human beings that were left at this place. And I will tell you, and I pulled out just a few, and I pulled them out with intent, just to give you an idea. They're filled with jargon, but you knew that was coming. Age and sex, status and role in prehistoric societies in Eastern North America, a PhD dissertation from New York University. Biological variation among and between two prehistoric Indian populations at Dickson Mounds. These titles, which are explanatory in their own right, give you an idea about the depth and breadth of the scientific enterprise that was undertaken to learn about the past. I prefer, and perhaps it is simply my way of dealing with this, is we have undying respect for the people who were laid to rest here. I see them personally as storytellers. They have something to tell us, and they need a muse, and those muses have been any variety of people who have viewed them and thought about them and shared with them and then have brought this information to us. So the muses are speaking essentially as the voice of people of the past. Sexual dimorphism in the adult foot of the human archaeological population. The last one here, the chronology of enamel hypoplastic growth disruptions, prehistoric, historic, and modern populations. The amount of scientific literature and enterprise that has been generated by materials in this institution is noteworthy. They are the kinds of things that have informed not only bioanthropology, but they've informed forensic medicine. They've informed ideas about understanding the breadth and variety of human populations and so on. And so the Dickson excavation, which many saw as their own interpretation in one way or the other, in some cases, in fact, in not an insignificant number of cases, deep concern about the fact that human remains were exposed to the public. Yet and still, they had something to tell us, and they have been a group of people who have told us things that we have not learned from anyone else. These storytellers have enriched us in ways that there has not been enrichments across the country. There is more to be done about that. And in fact, Alan and Jean Hampton, shown here, are working on a monograph, which I'm delighted to tell you I've seen reams of manuscript and illustrations and photographs of objects that will reveal soon the nature of what these storytellers have revealed to us. It's an unprecedented story. I'm also delighted to tell you, though I've mentioned to a few of you, I think, but I want to repeat because we have a broader audience here, that Stuart Striever, one of my graduate professors at Northwestern University, a longtime and dear friend of Alan, has spoken with us about this monograph, and his commitment to us is, especially when we heard we were going to be facing some difficulties, he is stepping forward and will raise all of the money that it takes to publish this volume. And so this piece will not stop its momentum because we will have some hiatus to deal with. It will go forward. And I think you will see that it will be deeply informative and a treasure in the academic world about what we've learned from this place. Now, I would be remiss, and though they're not directly a Dickson Mound folk, they come here because Dickson Mounds is what it is, and that Don Dickson has begun this excavation. Advancing archaeological methodology, there's conversations within my profession about where scientific archaeology really begins. There are a handful of places. I think there is a strong argument that this is one of those places. A.V. Kidder is doing things in the American Southwest. There's other work that's being undertaken by people in the Mississippi River Valley, but there's also work to be done here, and regional cultural sequence. And so it comes out that this group of people, and I noticed in looking at it earlier, no one was wearing overalls, and I don't understand. White shirts and bow ties. A distinguished group. And in fact, when you look at the list of people's names here, two things come immediately to bear. One is they begin systematic excavations on this landscape, which are terribly important. And two, the results of that work result in the Culture History Foundation, which is titled Rediscovering Illinois and is published in 1937. And is recognized in the annals of the history of archaeology as being one of those foundation stones that's laid down, that people look at a particular place, a region, and began then to assemble the history of the past in this place. And so that book becomes terribly important. And the third thing I would note to you is no less noteworthy, but essentially in the group of people who are portrayed here and another set of members of the University of Chicago, virtually all of us in one way, shape, or form can look at our archaeological pedigree and tie it back, especially Midwestern archaeologists can tie it back into this group of people. In other words, these are our forebearers, and for many of us, for example, the distance isn't too far away that some of the people who ended up being professors were the professors of my professor, and then I become a student of that person, and it brings this intellectual lineage and way of seeing things and doing things in historical perspective and so on. So the archaeological work undertaken here turns out to be terribly important as a cauldron for archaeological ideas to be moved forward and advanced, understandings of history to be created and disseminated, and for another generation of students to be educated to go on then to promote their own ideas about how the world works and to pass those on to students as well. Rediscovering Illinois lays this foundation. A great much of the terminology that's used in it to describe what the past and how it should be organized is published in this book. And I will tell you that in the collections of this institution we have a copy of the manuscript generated by typewriter and hand-scratched. Editorial remarks in that sits in a file drawer. In a sense, if you will, it's sort of like a Dead Sea Scroll to us who do archaeology in this part of the world. When we look at other places nearby, Ogden, Marion Ogden stood at this podium not long ago and articulated to us not only an archaeological perspective of this place, but a family history about that particular location. And in many ways, that site has given rise to an understanding of the evolution of mortuary ritual. And it's not so much in the undertaking of the excavations at that place, but it turns out that there are things we've learned, and really in a great sense from almost cursory examinations of that place. But what we now know, there are radiocarbon dates that are being generated, there are ceramic styles that are being generated, and what it looks to some of my colleagues is that this is the place, ground zero, of what becomes a significant cultural change that we recognize today as the Havana culture, as one of its manifestations. And so this place and the work that's done there, the excavation again by avocational archaeologists exploring some of the monuments in this place and bringing them to the light of the public, and then drawing the attention of archaeologists who come in behind and begin to look at it. Work at this place continues. This is an indication of some of the work we've done here recently, collecting artifacts off of the surface. The red dots represent the distribution of pieces of copper that were found in that field. We add to this as if it were a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. We've assembled about 25 pieces, and we go out and we find another one, and we're trying to figure out how it's pieced together. This early archaeological work, this is a very fine historical monograph that looks at the world in two ways. One, it is a compilation of early articles that were published in a variety of different venues, which have been assembled between the covers of this book for people to remind ourselves what the early archaeologists were exploring in this place. And then an introduction to that information is brought to bear by Ken Farnsworth, who gives us a contemporary assessment of what those early studies told us and how they've directed contemporary research and what it means to us today in our pursuit of this subject. What gives rise to this culture that would become the namesake for a great expanse of human society throughout the Midwestern riverine area? Now, in the 1960s and 70s, the Historic Preservation Act is passed in 1966. It profoundly changes the nature of archaeology, because essentially what it says is, if there is a federal undertaking that will have an impact on the landscape, there is then, therefore, an opportunity to assess the impact of that undertaking. And the assessment involves not only biological matters for threatened and endangered species, but it also involves history and archaeology as important scientific venues for, as part and parcel of a landscape. And so what this did is essentially created what we know by the acronym CRM, known as Cultural Resource Management, which has certainly evolved into the major force in American archaeology today. Without it, I would tell you that our knowledge of the past would be diminished multiple-fold. And so what it ended up doing is sending archaeologists out onto the landscape to different drainages, and the opportunity essentially was to knock on farms' doors and say, we're archaeologists, we're looking for archaeological deposits, artifact-bearing deposits in this river valley. Have you found anything? And if so, would you show it to us and tell you where you found it, and so on. And thus then began a long-running and much appreciated from our side of the ledger relationship with everyday people who work the ground, who would, from my own experiences, walk over to the tractor and raise the toolbox on the tractor fender and reach in and scramble around and throw out a crescent wrench and then a box end wrench and then 2 or 3 pieces of flint and show them to you and say, are any of these things older than 200 years? You say, well, as a matter of fact, that piece that's getting banged around in here is 9,000 years old. Oh, well. So, where'd you find it? And then the next thing you know, on remarkable budgets, I must tell you, the budgets for the Historic Site Survey were about $600 a spring. $600. That fueled a crew to go out, travel around. And it's difficult to see perhaps here, but I draw your attention to the little red polygons that are on this landscape. This is a presentation of a valley just below us, and a great many of those red dots were put on this map because you allowed us some access to a piece of ground to walk across back and forth systematically, to collect artifacts, to look at your collections, to make a spot on a map that said these kinds of things are found here, to fill out a piece of paper and send it into a giant file cabinet. And in time that file cabinet became contemporary and was expressed in a digital record. So this Historic Site Survey opened a door to allowing us to begin to look at a landscape in ways we hadn't. Now, I want to make a fine point here. Archaeologists are human beings. This comes as a surprise to me. And it turns out that much of the work that we undertook, we always like to find stuff, just like everybody else. And what it meant is we were largely stream-centric, if you will. We went to places where you'd expect to find big sites, and almost all of them tended to be in big valleys, and we spent very little time in the uplands. And when you look at the early site distributions, almost all of them are in riverine settings. What the Historic Site Survey allowed us to do was not only to work in those drainages, but started to put people to look at the upland surface. And then CRM work came along and literally forced us to go to the upland surface, and lo and behold, of no surprise, but certainly remarkable, we began to find that there was a record of human history in the uplands that was rich and varied and had different kinds of information that we had been able to accumulate in riverine areas. Finally, we were not so biased to the river, and we began to take a much broader view of the landscape. I would tell you that that survey also encouraged us to do other things. One of the things we noticed is there was a good deal of variation, especially in the stone objects that we found. And when we would look at collections, we'd get them back. We were, of course, curious about a particular point style. Was it an arrow point, a spear point, a dart point? How old was it? Was it early archaic or middle woodland, and so on? But one of the other things we noticed is there's lots of variation in the kind of stone. And it begged questions, anthropological questions. How are people acquiring this? Why are these people in a particular area using mostly this kind of chert? And, oh, by the way, if you're restricted to a particular area, is it likely that you use only a singular piece of chert, a singular variety of chert? Or if you've got variety, what does that mean? Are you trading for that material to get it? Are you traveling across the landscape and acquiring it as you go? All of a sudden, the anthropological energy to the questions gave us a much greater sense about human being and their behavior. And so one of the things that comes out of the Historic Site Survey, in particular by this institution, is that they begin going places where there are rock outcrops. And they collected those collections of those rocks, and we have a very appreciable collection of material. And in 1983, Dwayne sits down, writes a monograph, which gives us an idea about the variation of chert that can be found in the Lemoyne River Valley. We have continued that. We have acquired more material. People knew that we were doing this, so they gave us more. Bob Nail, an IAAA, Illinois Association for Advancement of Archaeology member for years, started a lithic type collection for the Midwest. When Bob passed, it made its way to here. So we have a renowned collection of stone that we can use to compare. And it's not only just macroscopically looking at this, looking at a piece of stone and saying, well, you know, I have that filed away, that's X kind of chert. What's happening now is we have Michigan State University anthropology students who are using modern technology, for example, laser ablation, and they're taking a piece of stone and they're exciting the hell out of those atoms and getting them to dance, and then looking at the results of it and realizing that they can look at the molecular composition of stone to try to see if they can pinpoint specific variety of stones, which give us a much better sense of how people are moving on the landscape or trading material. Things that Don Dickson, Alan Harn, and Mike Wiant couldn't imagine are now at our fingertips as we learn more about the archaeological record, and hence the collections themselves begin to have extraordinary merit. Now, this, it's hard to imagine this event, the Illinois Riverbank Survey, because in the last 2 years we've had colossal floods on this river, and the ability to look at the bank has not been very clear. In this case, the two things that came to mind are things like landscape visibility and human ecology, and the development of things like ceramic technology. You may recall, I hope you do, that in 1988-99 there was a profound drought. And that profound drought was felt. In fact, one graph I thought about putting here and then decided not to were stream gauge readings on Illinois River tributaries. And one of the things you see is when you get into the summer of 1988, the bottom falls out of all the creeks and rivers that flow into the Illinois. And what that means ultimately is that the Illinois River is flowing at pool altitudes which were rare. And what that means is that there are banks of the river, enormous expanses of banks of the river which are exposed. So, most of you will. A towboat captain is lamenting because he's pushing his barges aground. People who boat the river are lamenting because the river is so shallow it's difficult to get around. The archaeologists here are excited because, in fact, all that water going away means there are places that are now exposed to visibility, that they can go out and look at them and get some idea about what the river shoreline has to tell us about the past. Recall that in the 1870s, beginning in 72, then another in 76, and later on down to the LaGrange Lockett Dam and on to Campsville, there are small dams built with lock chambers to elevate the Illinois River to make it navigable. The state has invested enormously in the Wiant Canal. In 1848 it opens and everything's going just fine, except when you get the goods to the terminus at LaSalle, the going down river from LaSalle to the confluence of the Mississippi River is iffy because there's considerable variation in water depth. And so notions are undertaken, examined multiple times by engineers doing assessments of the river, and they end up building locks and dams to promote river navigation. Since the Illinois waterway is established in 1933, in large part, the banks of the Illinois River are inundated. And so with this drought and low pool altitudes, the riverbanks are exposed, and it gave the opportunity for this crew in what was, I would tell you, and so I wasn't involved in this, so I'm not chirping here, I will tell you it was the most innovative and bold use of state tax dollars in archaeology that's ever been undertaken. Let me give you a measure of this. These folks started the LaGrange Lock and Dam, or nearly at it, and they find their way all the way up to the Starved Rock Lock and Dam. Now, I don't think that they walked every square inch of that, but I'll tell you what, they worked virtually every square inch of that thing, and they began to accumulate a variety of information, of sites, of artifacts that were exposed in the landscape. It gave them some real new notions about the evolution of the Illinois River floodplain and the fact that there are indeed buried sites along the stretch of the river, not only inundated sites, but buried sites. And it began to reveal a cultural and artifact assemblage, the likes of which we hadn't seen. And I have only perused these from a distance, but I would tell you the reason I put ceramic technology on there is because the early days of ceramic technology are things we don't understand very well. And I would also tell you that there is not a finer collection of early woodland pottery, the first forms of ceramics, than Esri, Harn, Sampson, Santour et al. Picked up. David, there are many people in the room, picked up on the banks of the Illinois River that have given us insight, which is a rarely visible stretch of river. So that goes down as an extraordinary accomplishment. And it was not only the early forms of pottery. The other thing that I think is surprising, as we'll see in a moment, is that aboriginally people are living literally right on the riverbank for periods of time, and they're establishing some pretty significant communities there as well. So it begins to give us insight about where people are living and what are they doing. Now, in the late 1950s, up through 1960, the Evelyn site, this is one of the few archaeological sites in the Midwest that is preserved in a way that you can literally see beneath the ground. If you haven't done so lately, I encourage you to revisit us, go to the 3 low buildings that are on the lower reaches of this ground, and walk into those rooms and allow your imagination to run away with you, because what you're looking at are the remains of 3 buildings which are extraordinary in a great many ways. In some cases, their size and breadth and quality of preservation. In other senses, the geometry, the fact that one of them is expressed as an equal arm cross, an emblem that shows up in a variety of different venues 900 years ago or so. Another one, a circular building where we can only imagine, if the walls would speak to us, that there are a group of people in that building in the process of sweating, a practice which is carried out by a great many people all around the world as a very special way to cleanse oneself and to be reflective about the world. We know about that because the Evelyn site becomes the subject of archaeological investigation, and again, people around the room, Larry is involved in this, etc., to look at it. The cross-shaped building, an exceptional preservation, wall posts, central hearth, some of the roof timbers, it appears, materials on the floor. And I would tell you this thing is still talking to us. Within the last few months, Alan was sort of scrambling around out there looking for some charcoal to send off to get a better understanding about the antiquity of this place and its action. So these things reveal to us, in particular, this transition between late woodland people and the people who are also manifested in the Dickson Cemetery, and this cultural transformation which is blowing out of the American bottom, the Mississippian way of life. And we have some sense at this particular place where early Mississippian materials are represented that we can see, if you will, the waves of culture coming up this river valley and beginning to influence indigenous people living here. They are manifest in this site. They are manifest in the cemetery and the treatment of the dead in the Dickson Mounds Cemetery. So we have keen insight into what are the dynamics of way of life. Now, maybe I can illustrate this because the cross-section of this assembly, for those of you who are more distinctive than I am, which is a polite way of saying you're a little bit older, you're probably still wondering why a bunch of us started wearing bell-bottom pants, wearing moccasins, and growing all sorts of peculiar facial hair and long locks, because there was a cultural transformation that was underway, one that you probably didn't understand. As I reflect back on it, I'm not sure I understand it either. But those kinds of events in human society are extraordinary. What motivates them? How is it, does everybody partake in it, or just a handful of people? Does it have any overtones within the community other than just appearance? Is there some other activity to it? As anthropologists, we're most curious about these kinds of events, and we think that the archaeological record can give us insight into it. That site, we thought, had a lot more to tell us. And so one of our colleagues, Greg Wilson from the University of California, Santa Barbara, returned to us a few years ago, underwritten by a National Science Foundation grant to begin to look at early Mississippian societies in this area. One of the things he did is employ new forms of technology, in this case electrical resistivity, but also a gradiometer, to go back and forth across that site with the idea that there's more there to be learned, and to use this material to target places to excavate and then get back to work. Much to the surprise, I think, of everybody, at the end of all of the work that they did, there was virtually nothing left there. The excavations that had been conducted in the 50s and in 1960 had consumed that part of the site, and the areas which were left over appeared to be empty. And in fact, there was a little bit of a surprise. They did identify one structure. In opening up a backhoe trench and scraping the floors, they noticed that they had a wall trench corner. Looked at it, people came and looked at it again and again, and then it was discovered that in fact it was a building that we built as a reconstruction in that place, and it was preserved wonderfully in the archaeological records, so we have contributed in a sense. Meyer-Dickson, another undertaking which occurs related to the construction and of this building, and it gives a sense about local and regional variation in societies, and also, again, the sort of cultural issues about hinterland development. Cultures are rising elsewhere. What influence do they have on people in what we might refer to, even then aboriginally, as a rural area? Largely undertaken by a variety of people, accumulated a collection, and when Mike Connor joined us, a very welcome addition to our staff, one of his early questions was, I'm looking for things to do, what can we do? And Dwayne and Alan had created a list some years before, which were essentially our undone list. And, one of them had to do with late woodland societies. Mike is an expert on the subject. He decided to dig into it, and so he has published now 2 articles, one on the late woodland occupation at Meyer-Dickson, one on the Mississippian occupation at Meyer-Dickson. All of the dots you see, pit features, evidences of structures at this particular location. So in this case, the collection, waiting for us, waiting to be revealed, Mike has come in and taken a look at it and begun to not only piece together the story there, but then to interrelate it to some of the other pieces of information which we had gathered from other occupations. The Larson site, nearby on the bluff crest, neighboring the Waterford Cemetery. I made up the term, not really, Pompeii effect, but I put it in quotations, because of what this site reveals to us, and then issues about the use of domestic space. What I mean by the Pompeii effect is that, as Alan reminded me today, is that this is a first detailed look at the remains of the partial remains of a Mississippian town, and a particular part of the town which appears to have essentially just burned to the ground. And in revealing that, and you see multiple superimposed structures here, pit features, part of a stockade wall, insight into a small section of this community that gives us a view of not only the organization of residential space, that is to say the location of houses within the community, but when one looked at them in more detail, the distribution of artifacts on the floors of these buildings, which appear to have been burned, abandoned with a collective of artifacts. It's not the word I want to use, but it escapes me. Starts with a C. I have to get past this. Can you tell an anal and compulsive person who can't possibly go on with the lecture because he can't, with an assemblage of artifacts on here that give you a sense of how space on the floor of that place was used, and not only in a single structure but repeated, which then gives rise to ideas about the nature of these relatively small footprint residences and how people are using them to undertake certain kinds of activities. Norris Farms number 36. You've heard about this before. I will touch on it. Certainly the thing that rises to the fore is the issue of conflict. The overall notion of health is revisited because it turns out that this is a cemetery that had remarkable stories to tell. And then the idea of genetic variation, which becomes important as well. This thing results largely because of the Preservation Act. The Department of Transportation wants to regrade the slopes of the road as it rises up 7897 from the Illinois River floodplain up to the upland surface. They contacted the State Museum. Our colleagues who are in the room this evening go to look at the place and realize that there's what appears to be some significant archaeological potential there. They begin an excavation which turns out to reveal a prehistoric record that was unprecedented. And that work proceeds. It ends up being something that tells us about conflict in ways that we had not appreciated. So lying before us, before the excavation of this, we have this enormous expanse of human history. There is some evidence of violence in human history, but it's relative to pauper through time. If I remember my statistics, there's a very tiny fraction of singular digit percentages of evidence of violence in the Dickson Cemetery. And yet when you come to this place, it appeared that something approaching 30% of the adult population were subject to violence. How is it? Under what circumstances do human societies living in this river valley 900 years ago have a tiny fraction of evidence of conflict, and a couple centuries later there is a much more pronounced, profound, and dramatic evidences for violence? The monograph, the authors of whom many are in the room this evening, becomes one of the best-selling reports of investigations in State Museum history. It reveals to us and to our colleagues a view of the past, the likes of which we've not had. The royalties are coming. It'll be a while. You may have heard we have some financial difficulties. This then becomes the foundation, and the chapter in this book by George Milner and Virginia Smith reveals two dimensions of human society that are of considerable interest. One is the violence, but the other is the notion of human health. Human health and disease, the duress under which these people find themselves becomes of particular interest. The idea, when you look at the literature, it's as if you put a spontaneously generating organ on the academic table, and the next thing you know, it multiplies into 2, and then that multiplies into 4 and 6 and 8. And when you look at the literature, groups of graduate students begin to pick up on this, and the next thing you know, there's a raft of dissertations looking at conflict in human societies. Next thing you know, there are a raft of dissertations and published articles about warfare. under what circumstances do human societies pit themselves against one another, and ranging from incredible events where a man may stake himself on the edge of a plain village, put a peg in the ground and tie it around his ankle, and stand there and essentially defy aggressors to try to touch it, to other communities like New Guinea societies where you get two enormous lines of bedecked in extraordinary paraphernalia of warring societies who dance and mock one another, but at the first sign of blood retreat and consider the score settled. Humanity has peculiar ways of expressing issues about violence. This contribution of looking at the deep time record of a particular episode of violence becomes a spark, another spark to the torch, which brought an awful lot of attention to the subject. And it begged questions. Under what circumstances does this occur? Is it a situation where you've got two ways of life, essentially, which end up intersecting one another and then are competing for that particular place? Or are they circumstances where you've got a dominant society on a landscape, and on its perimeter you get another group of people, the wiggly yellow line representing some form of conflict of these societies? Or do you have one in which a Mississippian society is beginning to deteriorate, to collapse in and of itself, and other groups of people, stronger people, moving onto a landscape? So it gives you an opportunity to look at sociopolitical dynamics, the boundaries between people, and what does this mean, and how is it manifest in the record. One of the other things this does is it represents a period of time in which a young graduate student at Pennsylvania State University, it turns out a student of one of the authors of the Norris Farms osteology report, George Milner, is aware of new developments in technology in which it is clear that in human bone, preserved over long periods of time, that there are traces of DNA that are left. This is commonplace to us now. CSI rules the television world, and they use all of this variety of technology and means to begin to alert us to ways to solve problems. But it has an archaeological possibility. And it turns out, just a couple quotes that I've drawn from this, that Anne tells us, for example, that the mitochondrial DNA revealed a high level of diversity. The high level of diversity of the genetic signature tells us that the people who are there, who are laid to rest in that place, represent a broad variety of people, not just a very small sort of familial group. And two, she notes, the Norris Farms number 36 population demonstrates that ancient DNA can be a fruitful source of new insights, a new technique that can be applied to reveal new information about sites that becomes important. And it is, the DNA work has run away from itself. It's incredible what's happening. A dog skeleton excavated in this river valley in 1975 and recognized as one of the oldest domesticated dogs in North America. Turns out that it's in a lineage that begins in Europe 30,000 years ago. Because they were able to take the mandible of that dog, extract some bone, reproduce the DNA, multiply the DNA, and then compare it with DNA from a series of canids that comes back through Asia across to Europe and has a time scale to it, and all of a sudden we realize that the ancestry of domesticated dogs has a very long record indeed, still to be puzzled out. Morton site, part of the excavations that occur there as a result of the transformation of the farm, the installation of telephone connections along the roadway. Each one of these reveals a little bit of piece of the past. And slowly they are assembled. There's a house here, a pit feature there. And the landscape begins then to be understood in greater complexities, which ultimately, as we see, will be brought to bear on subsequent excavations. In other instances, we have the opportunity, because the Corps of Engineers is brought to bear on Liverpool, Illinois. Liverpool, Illinois is a place that is flooded frequently, and so there were opportunities in 1985 to go to Liverpool, as an example, and to begin to look at the footprint of a levee that would be built through town. We knew of this place because of some of the University of Chicago work. Here, the profile of one of the Liverpool mounds. The dark substrate below it, the excavation of a mound above it. Rediscovering Illinois would be the platform in which many of these old societies were brought to our attention. But then it turns out that there's excavations undertaking on the bank of the river that gives us insights into some of these sites, ones that have been seen at different points of times, Illinois River shoreline, and brings us the discovery of enormously interesting artifacts. And I will tell you, just by way of personal anecdote, by some strange chance, I happened to be there the day that this was found. And mind you, I wasn't fortunate enough to be a part of it at all. The director of excavations, who's sitting in the back row, had encouraged me to go downstream a little bit and shovel into the wall of this incredible accumulation of modern alluvium. And I'm down there working my way away, and I noticed a group of people upriver, sort of waist deep in the water, with some enormous exhilaration. And I'm thinking, well, they're just cooling off in the water. And they keep going, come here. It's like the sirens and Odysseus' travel. Come this way. Well, I'm not going down there because you guys are going to drag me into the water and I don't want to get all wet. I'm digging up here. Well, the exhilaration was unavoidable finally. So I mosey down there thinking, okay, splash me, get it over with. And one of them has the top of that piece and is holding it up like this and said, look what I found in the water. At my feet in the water. Could be. Well, you can bet. My boots are off, socks are off, I'm in the water, I'm padding around in this thing like everybody else. And before long, Karen Sanke found the first piece, as I recall, finds the second piece in 2.5 or 3 feet of water, pulls it up and goes, look at this, here's the other part of it. Holy cow. So, those discoveries are complete serendipity. But they all of a sudden reveal a piece of expression which says more than you can imagine just gazing at it here because of the expression of this dual-headed bird and the way that it's... So an excavation which is looking at terra firma turns out to be aquatic archaeology and reveals an artifact the likes of which begin to spark a whole new series of investigation. Now, that serendipity becomes a really important part of what we do. People walk in the door of this place all the time. And they come in the door and they often have their hands in their pockets or they've got a sack with them and you never know what it's going to be. Sometimes it's just a rock, a fossil. In some cases it's a piece of bone and they say, you know the question, what is this? And it's inspected and it turns out to be a bone of a particular character. Well, that looks like a bison bone. The next question is natural. Where'd you find it? The third question, always set aside for presentations to a public audience, is how much is it worth? But we don't talk about that. So it turns out that piece of bone from a bank on the Illinois River near Mapleton becomes the subject of a considerable amount of interest. People step up, they underwrite some of the excavation. Some of you, Alan, out there digging trenches in it, trying to figure out the nature of the archaeology there, and then incredible serendipity. The remains of a bison. The remains of a bison, which the day before the radiocarbon assay on these bones are found, one would have thought that it's probably 3 or 4 years younger, 3 or 4 times younger than it turned out to be. It turns out to be 2,300 years old or more. It turns out that there are things found in juxtaposition in the water that are remarkably surprising. And when reassembled in some examination, I well recall the day that Alan walked up to me and he had the end of that rib and he goes, look at the damage on this rib. God, that's pretty fantastic. Watch this. They stick together. So all of a sudden, a pedestrian discovery of an object by one of you brought to our attention results in its discovery, which completely changes our ideas about the past. This, too, would become the subject of a monograph, with an article by Alan and Bruce McMillan and Terry Martin working on it, reveals enormously interesting things, but I will tell you, what it does best is it begs questions. What I like to ask the 5th graders, when we bring them to this museum and we give them tours, we take them to the bison in the front door. It's there, by the way, because when I went to the Denver Museum of Natural History and walked in the door, they had a dinosaur standing there. I thought, oh, that's great. The Field Museum, elephants and dinosaurs. We had to be part of that. We got to put something on our front door. Well, let's put a bison in there. And I will tell you, everybody walks in the door and looks at it. So we use it as a teaching method to talk about archaeology. What is it? And a 4th grader said to me one day, what's it take to be an archaeologist? I started the graduate school answer. I can tell you that that lecture was over before it started, because they're looking at me with, what are you talking about? So I asked them this question, can you read? They said, I can. Can you do some arithmetic? Absolutely. Can you write? No doubt about it. Well, what you do and what I do is exactly the same except for one thing. We learn to read these objects. And then I asked them to read them. Is it a bone, plant, animal? But ultimately it gets to the point, do you notice something missing? And they say, well, yeah, the legs are missing. And so I asked them what that means. I learned that you have to be very careful about asking a question, because if you say, what does it mean that the legs are missing? The first fifth grader looked at me and said, the bison can't walk. I wasn't headed in that direction. I had to make a U-turn, but to reinforce this point about science, that discovery in its presentation, in its recovery, begs questions. Where are the legs? What does it mean? Does it mean they're field dressing this creature? Isn't it curious that other sites that we know of at that time period, at least to the best of our knowledge, and it's a tiny little fraction of information, we don't find bison bone on them. So how is it that you can have people hunting bison, but in the villages that we know about right now, they're not bison bone? So like any important scientific enterprise, at the end of the day we learn things, but we learn enough to ask another question. Sometimes those questions are imponderable, and we may not have much luck answering them. We are close to the end here. The Emaquan Preserve, you know it is a transformation of this landscape. What it gave us the opportunity, and in fact I would tell you before this assembly in particular, that Alan is really 95 years old. And I want to tell you that by walking back and forth across that floodplain all the times that he did, he gave himself 20 years of longevity. He was fit, trim, it was magnificent. What it also meant in all of those places that you see in the floodplain was a accumulation of a new assemblage of site information, which is in a volume, 600 generations there. The Nature Conservancy's transformation of that landscape opened the door for us to begin to look at that landscape in some detail, in a variety of different ways. It brought some of our colleagues here, something that Alan has talked about a good bit. One of our colleagues, Ed Hajik, who is a geomorphologist of some note with respect to the history of the Illinois River, dug a series of cores into that river and pulled them out, gave us a remarkable record of depositional history in this river, which gave us not only a sense of the natural ecology of the river, but its character over time, and then, of course, how humanity articulated to that. And it's no secret, when you look at the animal bones that are found at the Morton site excavation, that it's pretty clear that these aquatic habitats that were evolving in the Illinois River floodplain contributed mightily to the well-being of the people living on the bluff overlooking those rivers. And when we go to this place, we talk, coined a term because it was desperate, it was about 642 and this wasn't done, archaeological efficiencies and cultural transformations again. What I mean by the efficiencies is that the amount of energy that archaeologists expend, and a good many of us have been doing archaeology long enough that our approach to it was you go to a place, talk to a farmer, find out there were artifacts, walk back and forth in that field on a spring morning after a hard rain. In time, we became more sensitive about the spatial distribution of artifacts, so we put pin flags every place, we map them, we try to get some idea of the spatial distribution. Then we dig holes. Well, we couldn't dig many holes because it's a lot of labor, etc. All of these things would take a remarkable amount of time. And quite frankly, as archaeology became more expensive, our capacity to excavate large expanses was pretty limited. The archaeological efficiencies in this are the fact that we use remote sensing technology now, relying on a whole series of physics of the ground, through electrical resistivity, through variations in magnetic fields, to radar imagery, that now that landscape that you saw obscured by vegetation really looks like this beneath the surface of the ground. Every one of those spots, squares, rectangles, circles, and so on, representing places where there is subsurface structure in the form of buildings, remains of ancient buildings, in the form of trash pits and hearths and so on. And it was particularly revealing to us in the upper right-hand corner. You notice that small square of an area, excavated in some greater detail this summer, a place in a field that many of us walked back and forth a great many times and hardly seen a thing. The surface did not belie the history of that place. Once the remote sensing was run across it, it was clear that in fact that there were remains of buildings that lay beneath the surface which had no surface manifestation. So the efficiencies are we can spend an afternoon walking over a plot of ground, do the output on a computer, a laptop